Some of the best interviews come from questions that emerge during natural, organic conversation. Sometimes this can simply mean switching up your outline structure. Other times it can mean going off script entirely.
Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hi, I'm Tristan. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. This show is brought to you by my company, Motion. We are a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. So let's say you have a very exciting interview coming up for your company's podcast. Let's also say your guest frequently appears on other podcasts as well, so they know the drill. And because your guest has some great experience you want to cover, you know there's a lot you can talk about that'll help your own audience. But you're worried. You're worried that your guest will just repeat the same thing she said on a podcast last month. And you're wondering how you can get something deeper from your guest, something more detailed that'll be unique for your audience. Well, in this episode, we're going to outline 3 tips that'll help you craft more interesting podcast interview questions. The types of questions that'll get something different out of your guests. The first tip is ask the unexpected. And the second tip is to listen and adapt. And the third tip is asking follow-up questions to capture the details. So let's start with asking the unexpected. I can't stress how much guests are tired of being asked, can you tell us a little bit about your background? The chances are, if you secured a guest for your interview-style podcast, they're not a stranger to being interviewed in some form. They've heard every single obvious question you could ever think of. They've explained the same things countless times. So at a certain point, the guest will simply switch on their autopilot mode and regurgitate the same thing they said on their last podcast, a podcast that could be one of your competitors. A guest on autopilot does nothing for your show, and it does nothing for your audience either. You want your listeners to tune in with some ideas of what they'll hear, but they don't want to know everything that's about to happen in the episode. Your job as a podcast host isn't to just ask a question and let the guests go on with whatever they're going to say. You need to push for something unique, something that wasn't featured on the last podcast your guest was on. Asking great podcast questions often means going against the grain. You have to stray from the path to get unheard and valuable insights from your guests. This is why it is so important to research your guest ahead of time. Listen to the past couple of podcasts they've done to find out common questions, and you will quickly find what not to ask. If you want to push your podcast to the top, be the opposite of every other podcast out there. Focus on getting answers to unique questions and keep the conversation engaging. Here's an example of a question that gets the background information from the guest without asking about their background. You've been a high school English teacher for over 20 years, based on my calculations, and you launched your first episode of 1% Better, which is your podcast. And I wanted to ask, what is the biggest thing that Mr. Ferraro, the English teacher, has in common with his alter ego, Joe Ferraro, the podcast host?
I hope it's a combination of curiosity and energy, right? I want to bring both to the table every day. And as I say that, I think about work ethic. And it's weird for some people to hear podcasting work ethic. And God knows where we are with the state of the appreciation or mindset around teachers. Who knows if work ethic is one of the first things that comes to mind. But when I think you put those 3 together, my dad is a restaurant owner, still working as we speak. He's probably flipping eggs and making designer omelets. He doesn't call out, he doesn't take days. And I feel like trying to ship a podcast every Sunday is something you know about week after week, that consistency. But also I have to attack things with curiosity, bringing guests on that light me up, asking my students questions that I feel like have general application, and then just bringing the energy, right? Sometimes I'd rather be told to dial it down a little bit. And, I have a class at 8 a.m. often, and I'm not sure seniors want to hear the energy that I bring at 8 a.m. But it's that thermostat versus temperature and thermometer idea that I try to adhere to. So I feel like that's a combo platter I like to live in.
All right, now let's talk about the second tip, listening and adapting. Some of the best interviews come from questions that emerge during natural, organic conversation. Sometimes this can simply mean switching up your outline structure. Other times it can mean going off script entirely. And while this may seem counterintuitive, this is where the most insightful and valuable content gets revealed. The more your guest gets to talk about a certain subject, the more emotion they'll start to put into what they are saying. This emotion leads to more incredible and impassionate answers. And cutting off someone's train of thought to continue with your pre prepared podcast questions can mean you miss out on some of those stories and insights that keep your listener engaged. Well, recently, I had Trent Anderson from Podchaser on the show, and he dropped a nugget about failing during his first few podcast attempts. So rather than just letting that go, I wanted to find out why. So Trent, you mentioned you had some failed podcasts.
Yeah.
So and you didn't get past that infamous, pod fade, whether it's 5 or 7 episodes, depending on which research you pull from.
Right.
It's one of the two or whatever. Like what happened there? What was the biggest obstacle that you faced where you couldn't get over that hurdle?
Yeah, I could have used someone like you, truly, at that point in time. And I did this with Pre-Write, and I did it with Lead Leo. And I thought this is like the perfect way we're going to get great conversations going with people that we know should be using our product. And I think that was the limiting element of it. So it was mostly like, how can these people help serve our interests, and more and less about like, how can we help our audience? Because we didn't have an audience. And that's a really interesting part, because I think the audience building angle is what I became somewhat obsessed with after that. And now I see this every single day at Podchaser. A lot of podcasts stall out because if you're shouting into the void, you don't have an audience, you have very little motivation to keep going.
The last tip to crafting more interesting interview questions is about the follow-up. You need to ask follow-up questions to really get the details. Human nature is a funny thing. If you're heading into a structured interview, you'll likely arm yourself with some prepared statements and try to avoid certain subjects. Yet, in a casual conversation, those defenses all come down. The more comfortable a guest gets in the conversation, the more they'll be willing to share. It's important to ask the right podcast questions, but it's even more important to make sure you build a strong personal connection with your guest. Once you establish that connection, you'll find the guest gives a much more interesting interview, with openings you can squeeze into for insights not found on other shows. This is why follow-up questions are so important. If you hear something that stands out during your conversation, don't be afraid to push it a little further. If what comes from that follow-up doesn't add value, you can simply edit it out of the final episode later. It's like the old saying goes, you don't ask, you don't get. Here's a clip from an episode I did with Andrew Warner, where I wanted to get a sense of something a bit more personal. I decided to ask about his kids because this is something he alluded to earlier on in the conversation. And that's actually a challenge I've had personally, because I owned a video agency before Motion was created. So I was always used to being behind the camera, did a lot of documentary style films, completely off camera. You never heard me. I was in the transcript a little bit here and there, but it's new being a podcaster. I'm actually sharing the screen, so to speak. And I've thought about that with regards to my work and how maybe my kids will be able to see some of these thoughts and some of these stories that I share, which were largely behind the camera and non-existent for a large portion of my career. What do you feel like your kids will get from this enormous collection of interviews with entrepreneurs? Like how can they get inspired?
I think as they go back and look at my work, they're going to see the full me, where I remember at one point I was about to do a marathon on every continent, and I realized some of these places I'm going to are, who knows, because I'm doing self-guided marathons, doing 26.2 miles, sometimes in the middle of nowhere. I might die just randomly, right? Something could happen. And so I left a text message for my family saying, here's what I think should happen to this, here's what should happen to that. And if the kids want to know me, they could go back and listen to my interviews, and they should be prepared to get to know me through more. No single thing is fully me that I've said, but all together you can get a sense of who I am in the most truthful possible way.
Hopefully, these 3 tips will help you craft more interesting questions and get more details or unique stories from your guests. Let's recap those again for you real quick. The first tip is ask the unexpected. The second tip is to listen and adapt. And the third tip is to ask follow-up questions to capture the details. Well, that's all I have for today. Thank you for joining me on Recorded Content, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to Recorded Content, a show brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcasting agency for B2B tech marketers. We do the podcast stuff so you can focus on strategy, building brand awareness, and developing new relationships. To learn more about how you can launch and grow a podcast for your company, check out motionagency.io. Thanks for listening to Recorded Content.